Thank you to Steve and Bryony for having me here. It's really exciting to be in my first in-person event in quite some time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about Jon John's archive, and I guess a way in which it complements what Steve was just talking about is that I think what I've tended to do is work with archives in order to really think in methodological terms about how the archive yields the materials for thinking about and recovering in some ways, or reinvesting energy and thought and value and all those sorts of things in archives belonging to people who haven't been properly, assessed, understood, valued, etc. And then what that does is not simply sort of show how that's done, but I think I tend towards wanting to find the kind of a sympathetic, emotive, desiring relation to the materials and the stories, the narratives that emerge from those often fairly mute and banal sort of bits and bobs left in archives. So I'm not going to talk a huge amount about archives and the archiving impulse and so on, but I'm really happy to talk about that later. I'm just going to talk about some things in the archive and see how they offer up ways of relating to them in kind of embodied ways. So, the background to this is that I initiated an Archives of Live Art at Queen Mary, a series of collections that began really with Jon John's materials, in dialogue with the artist and with his executor Paul King as Jon John was approaching the end of his life. We also have the papers of Catherine Araniello, Ian Hinchcliffe and Julia Bardsley, very different artists but all coming under this kind of nebulous term, live art I suppose. So I'm going to talk about Jon John's archive, and I just sort of say as well that I did know Jon John socially, and we kind of moved in the same scene, especially when I was making performance, and I've seen a number of his performances, but I'm going to focus on works from the very end of his life, which very few people saw live, and I'm going to kind of reconstruct them really from the materials that are in the archive. So Jon John was born Jonathan Arias in 1983 in Bayonne in the French Basque, and his heritage was Basque, Argentinian and Spanish Roma, and in a manifesto in the archive he writes, quote, "The complexity of my ethnicities gave dimensionality to my religious upbringing. We are a Catholic family that practices magic. My people gave me the gift of healing bodies and conjuring spirits," end quote. And his work consists, as you can see from the archive, and it is open to visitors if you just get in touch if you want to see the materials in person, but they consist of, I think, kind of four key areas. Firstly is documents of performance of what I would call ritual endurance, typically including bloodletting, the use of opulent materials, pearls, gold, brass, and elaborate or sentimental titles. And the earliest documented work is from 2008 and until his last performance in 2017. Another kind of material in the archive is a lot of documentary work of a lay anthropological nature, drawing on ceremonies of endurance, mortification of the flesh, and initiation that he observed in Sri Lanka, in Iran, Bahrain, and elsewhere. And this includes videos, artifacts used in ceremonies, such as piercing instruments, objects to hang from the skin, including bells and bangles from the Kataragama and Ashura rituals. And a third area is materials relating to the professional practice of body modification. So he practiced this from AKA, a studio and a piercing and tattoo studio that he set up in Berlin and then in London. And he was his bread and butter essentially was from doing scarification, subdermal implants, things like that, and also making jewellery. We don't have the jewellery, but there is a lot of it. And finally, which I'm going to focus on more, is a series of works he made after becoming terminally ill, in which he painstakingly documented his treatment for cancer, for lymphatic cancer, and made a farewell final action. And so he died in his birthplace in Bayonne on the 6th of April 2017, which is 5 years to the day today, and he was 33 years old. So the archive records a lot of the full range of his work, but there's actually very little in the way of papers, which is what you sort of tend to expect to find in an archive. The reason is that they were all, the majority of these were online, and his website was deleted for non-payment when he was dying or shortly afterwards, and his emails disappeared because of the loss of a laptop. And without the laptop, it's been impossible to access his commercially, the commercial email provision that he relied on, and so some of it has been reconstructed through the Wayback Machine, but the majority of material is lost. Just to very briefly say a little bit about his kind of signature performances. So an example could be The Two of Us, which was probably his most widely performed piece. And in this he's naked, except for a large accumulation of pearls. He has an IV line passes into the crook of his elbow and into a small vase of flowers, and the roses are nourished by the blood, and then pearls distributed to everyone. We then feed him pearls mouth to mouth, and he washes the pearls down with a glug of milk. And then he uses the IV to write The Two of Us repeatedly on white linen, repeating the phrase in his freely flowing blood until he shakes, slips, collapses, and is carried out. And a lot of these materials are in the archive, reams and reams of blood-written fabric. So then the work gave rise to a series of objects, an exhibition called Roses Drinking Blood, where he took this part of Two of Us and made it into a separate work, and he fed roses on his own blood diluted with water. These were preserved and then sold to support an artist's book, which is in the archive. And the archive contains a large amount of these roses, which are incredibly fragile and incredibly beautiful. You can see very much where the white roses have drawn up the blood into the veins, and so that the rose skin looks very much like human flesh or similar. He made many other actions, photo shoots, prints, and so on, but I'll focus on the later works. Well, I'll focus on an early work and then the later works today. He also made collaborations, most prominently with Ron Athey, who appears a bit later. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this very little known work from 2008, which was called Gorgeous, but is also known as the Mole Piece. And so around 2008, Jon John developed an angry-looking lump on his arm which grew large and turned black. And he consulted a physician who diagnosed it as a large but benign mole. And Jon John asked the body hacking kind of artist pioneer Lucas Spira to remove it in a performance, and undertook it in a festival in Fribourg in 2008. And so prior to the action, he cast, using his training in goldsmithing, he cast the exterior of the mole and created a solid gold replica, and then carved the underside in a geometric shape that resembles, to me, ragged quartz. In the performance action, Zapira cut off the mole and pulled the gold cast from the vagina of another collaborator, the fetish performer Totemic. And the action was recorded in 10 Polaroids by the artist Bastien Jean, and these are all in the archive. And according to Paul King, who I mentioned as his executor, the tumour was not in fact benign. It was subsequently understood to be a malignant melanoma. Left untreated beyond Spira's rudimentary surgical procedure, the cancer spread, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma in 2015. The archive holds the Polaroids, the 1-ounce gold cast wrapped in gauze inside a velvet pouch, as well as the crudely excised tumour. black, shriveled and fibrous looking, the tuber sits in a medical specimen container labelled with his surname, a remnant from the subsequent testing. And there's a lot to say about this, about the ethical or other questions that emerge from the tumour itself being in the archive. And well, let's talk about it later, because it's quite detailed, and I'm just going to crack on with the more emotive aspects. But essentially we had to do research to investigate whether or not we could keep the work, and subsequently whether or not we can show it. And actually we aren't allowed to show it, which is why the image has been sort of redacted, even though it's not, you can't exactly see it very clearly. Okay, so this is itself, I think, a very unique or certainly a very anomalous relic. And it's a prompt to consider what kinds of documentation, because it is a mode of documentation of the action, different kinds of documentation such as video, images and relics bring us closer to or pull us further away from the kind of originary act of performance. And there's a lot of writing and thinking about this in performance studies, and again we can work through some of this later, about whether or not there is an originary performance as such, and whether different documents do have this magical function of drawing us into a dialogue with this event which we've either been at or have missed. And I think the relic, the tumour as relic intensifies the intimate effect of blood on canvas, which we also have in the archive. And uncannily, I think when you hold the tumour in its casing, which I've done and many other people will have done, students, for example, who I've introduced the work to, I think when you hold that fragment, you hold a fragment of the body of the artist, which is anomalous, which is an unusual effect, even if other modes of document seem to pretend to sort of model that kind of intimate relation. And so we hold this fragment of the body years after the event and after his death, and the piece of flesh becomes kind of totemic. It's inert, superfluous, but also played this part in the performance, but also in the death of the artist, and links forward to, like proleptically, to a series of works which examine the experience of cancer and its treatment much more explicitly, which is what I'll move on to now. Okay, so after, what time am I going until? Okay, that's fine. Okay, so in the archive is a large range of very different kinds of works which are about or made in response to Jon John's ongoing experience of the effects of cancer and the effects of its treatment. This includes, and most of these works are not known very well and certainly haven't been shown except for very specific instances. So in around 2015, he started making collodion wet plate photographs, and these are a mid-19th century precursor to the daguerreotype, and it uses wet glass plates, which are very fragile, very easy to mark, and very easy to destroy. And they're developed in a silver nitrate bath using albumin paper, which is extremely toxic, the nitrate bath. It also potentially explosive and damaging to the camera, but also to the camera person. And so there's this use of a mode which is toxic, but also that carries a danger or a risk. And so it seems to emulate and to sort of add nuance in some ways to the earlier explorations of physical risk or danger, scarification, holes in the body, and so on. And he was drawn to this mode of black and white photography, in part because he was examining, I think, his own experience of vitiligo. So during chemotherapy, he started to lose pigment in his skin and hair. And so the camera seems to exacerbate or emphasize this effect in his own skin. It also resembles, I think, the Victorian mugshot, partly because of the mode, and also the kind of memorial photograph. So the modes of early photography, as people like Amelia Jones have written, were actually used often to represent death or to represent imitations of death in the 19th century. And so they also represents or sort of approaches the seance photograph, another 19th century mode of sort of illusionistic representation, also used in sideshow portraiture, and sought to manifest the supernatural presences, often by double exposure or by manipulating materials such as wet tissue to seemingly capture ectoplasm issuing from the mouths and eyes of the subject being photographed. Paul tells me that, quote, he did a beautiful series of self-portraits, both in the traditional grey tone as well as in a mixture with his own blood, creating reddish tones. And I haven't got any of those to show you, unfortunately. Then more directly and urgently, probably I think using his phone, he documented the process of chemotherapy, hooked up to IV lines, which I imagine assuaged the pain and or the boredom of this process by photographing himself candidly or campily throughout the treatment and other processes. These works are a sort of a very kind of candid, sort of seemingly unmediated attempt to capture the experience he was undergoing. But it also, I think, relates to the history of phototherapy. So this is a work by Joe Spence, who coined this term to think about how the process of documenting treatment in Joe Spence's case, breast cancer, could stage a creative intervention into it, could claim agency over a process that typically subordinates the kind of the patient's experience, likely for good reason, to medical authority. And the phototherapeutic response can work as a kind of antidote to practices that privilege objectivity and which can therefore be received as unfeeling, even harmful, even if those who deliver it, the nurses and doctors, are not in themselves either of those things. And it develops into a sub-history of performance as well. For example, in the work of Annie Sprinkle, who also made strikingly similar works to Jon John's, in the sense of sort of creating a sense of burlesque or similar pantomime even around the experience that would otherwise be, as I say, sort of painful and or boring. And another example would be Genesis Peorage, who has since passed away, and where Sprinkle's work is itself a kind of project. I think Briar Peorage's was part of a broader project of simply documenting the whole of their life as an evolving artwork. Okay, so one of the works that is documented extensively in the archive is a piece called Love on Me, which The Finest Hour, which lends itself to the title of this presentation. And this was a farewell performance on the 10th of March in 2017 at a small gallery in Bayonne in France. And as he explained in a project statement kept in the archive, he writes in part, "I have cancer. I was given a slim chance of surviving. My first reaction was fear and self-blame. Somehow I caused this sickness." And he describes being influenced by Ron Athey's performances as a living corpse over 35 years of surviving HIV/AIDS, and by reading Susan Sontag's Illness and Metaphor, a copy of which, his copy, is kept in the archive. After Sontag, he writes, one of cancer's associated metaphors was, quote, "the repression of a desire. A suppressed longing gets literally balled up as a voracious tumour." He writes, "If cancer is a disease of passion, will love aid my struggle?" End quote. His optimism is painful, considering how close to death he was at the time of writing. He live streamed the performance on Facebook and specifically described it and designed it as a goodbye gesture. And what was transmitted was very difficult to watch. The show, I'm going to just describe the show, reconstruct it with some of the images that remain. It began with a series of images that were exhibited in the gallery, which were self-portraits by Jon John as a sort of anteroom to the exhibition. And I'll come back to them in a little bit. But the performance itself included a series of rituals for a very small audience, mostly consisting of his family and friends. And he began with blow-drying a thermal mask and wig that he constructed, which changed from reddish pink to white. He also wrapped his face in bandages and lay on a hospital bed, and witnesses placed open or closed or half-closed eyes on his face and body. and the attendants dripped hot wax from homemade candles made of soy and blood, some shaped by Jon John's hand to resemble tumours. All the while, a local musician played accordion and sang songs, and the performance closed with Jon John, naked and emaciated, singing a shakily beautiful rendition of "I Will Survive" in French. On 22nd of March, 10 days later, Paul King writes to me, quote, "This has been a beautiful yet brutal process being by John's side. He's just entered the hospital for what will be the last time. It's hard to say how long it will be before he passes, but he's ready. With no fear, no regrets, and no resentments, and with nothing left unsaid." And he passed away 3 weeks later. And in the archive, the archive includes his statement of intent, the thermal mask and wig, the hand-moulded blood candles, a vial of dried blood, a red Adidas tracksuit spotted with wax, mirrored eye-shaped symbols made from laser-cut acrylic, also dotted with wax, white bandages soaked in sweat, and the prints exhibited in the exhibition. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about how maybe one reads or responds to all these very emotive, perhaps anomalous, difficult materials. So I think there's really three linked ways, which are to do with, firstly, this kind of question of self-loss and self-determination in performance, really a question about cancer and its treatment, and also, finally, an issue around the kind of ethics of performance, I suppose. And so firstly, I would just say that Jon John's earliest and arguably signature works chime with a thesis that the performance of extremity is a project of calculated self-loss, that one undergoes a trauma, undergoes a process of duress in order to shake the assumption that we have an authentic sense of self to fall back upon. And many kinds of work, including, for example, the work of Bonetti, for example, could be read as experiencing the pleasure or possibility that attends to such refusals of authenticity or of self-sameness, that destroy or shake the myth of a monolithic self-same subjectivity, which is lost or erased or at least thrown. However, in the midst of illness, I think Jon John turns to a different project, namely to secure himself, to secure a sense of self in the face of suffering, endurance, and finitude, or mortality. And this could, for some, be a kind of conservative move, and it is conservative in the literal sense of being an effort to conserve what's left of oneself, of an identity, of a life, of a place in the world, as an artist or just simply as a person among one's friends and family. However, in the cancer works, his photographic hospital diaries and Love on Me, his work finds a new and perhaps more nuanced form and function, all the more sad and moving for coming so late. And so this is interesting. There's not enough time really to go very deep, but just to think that there's something here about thinking and assessing the kind of, I guess, sort of optimistic or ungrounded claims one might make, and I have made, for the stakes of like losing oneself in the jouissance of desire and sex and performance and so on, and for really thinking about how one asserts one's own subjectivity and one's own sort of security, which feels urgent, necessary, and fundamental here because the body in question is under siege. So then to think about cancer itself and this question of survival or therapy or simply as representation, as gestured to by the Joe Spence precedent. So I'll just read a little bit of something I wrote reading Anne Boyer's book, The Undying, a really beautiful recent book, The Undying, A Meditation on Modern Illness. So in her book, Anne Boyer argues that cancer is always historically and socially contingent, and that its experience is determined by the historicity of one's body, as well as by race, gender, class, income, and for her as a person in the US, profoundly by nationality. This is cancer's stubborn chronicity, she writes. She writes, quote, "No patient is sovereign, and every sufferer, both those marked by cancer treatment and those marked by the exhausting routine of caring for those with cancer, is also marked by our historical particulars, constellated in a set of social and economic relations." End quote. She experiences breast cancer as perhaps the most particular of cancers and anatomizes the process of chemotherapy as a form of discipline to be endured, made less survivable by the corporeal and social horrors that she describes as attending it. As, quote, as the social enforcement of medical compliance, as she puts it, and in the new worlds of pain, an abyss of debilitation, grief, loneliness, and abandonment. She writes that the person with cancer is the most object-like of all possible objects, a thing to be discarded like trash, and at the same time the most human that one can be, a subject in pain, at times pitiable, exhausted, feared, or forlorn. Cancer brings the subject back to the body cruelly and catastrophically, as I think we see in the documented works that we're looking at. So Boyer writes, quote, "Illness vivifies the magnitude of the body's parts and systems. In the sickbed, the sick disassemble, and this disassembly crowds a cosmos, organs and nerves and parts and aspects announcing themselves as unfurling particulars. A malfunctioning left tear duct, a new universe. A dying hair follicle, a solar system. That nerve ending in the toe, now eviscerating under chemotherapy drugs, a star about to collapse." So I think what happens in the archive is that many of these ideas come together in maybe surprising ways. And so I think just a short sort of, I just wanted to put three images that I've shown you together to think about three bodies that are seemingly about wholes. So the mole body excision, as we see on on your left, where we see the mole body being extracted from a vagina, the MRI scanner, which has a body inserted into it, and the cactus with the mouth with a cactus inside it. And so just very quickly, I think we see here this idea of the mole body, a body that reproduces itself, not as a prosthetic, but as a teratological addition to it. This is then sort of the body birthing something in an ontogenetic sense, reproducing itself, as I said, which is how cancer works. The underside of the mole, the gold mole, looks possibly mineral, possibly technological, suggesting this kind of general confusion of categories of matter. The holes in bodies and bodies in holes, we get this sense of the sick body and its parts eroticized, deposited inside another body, housed there in the way that the mole body, cast in gold, then belongs in a different body and gives pleasure perhaps, but a pleasure that is non-procreative, unlike the hyper-procreativity of the cancerous mole. We also see the body in the tunnel is the body of the patients undergoing an experience of great patience. The body is there to be surveyed, to be hopefully appeased in its suffering, but in this case not finally. Holes in the final image, I think, become dangerous or painful places, stuffed with many-headed cactuses, or having coughed it up, either way rendering the hole impenetrable and incapable of speech beyond moaning in pleasure or groaning in pain. This is Boyer again on the chemotherapeutic body. Quote, "We have poisonous vaginas and poisoned sperm. Our urine is so toxic that the signs in the bathroom of the cancer pavilion instruct patients to flush twice. We do not look like people. We resemble a disease before we resemble ourselves." So Love on Me, a final just thought on this is that the Love on Me, the Finest Hour can also be read as a commitment to performing at the very edge of a life beyond the point of recovery, which I think is, if not unique, is unusual. Even if performance art often mimes the impression of a body at the limit of its capacity to survive. So the body and its rituals, I think, for a time, survive in the blurry terrain between being alive and being dead. And the work is definitively not to be repeated, only just to be sustained. And it's barely even there in the moment of its performance, not least because of the flickering transmission of the Facebook live stream, which was at times very difficult to follow and that dropped in and out. And I think just one point is to say that there are many explorations in live art of the ethical problem of how to live as perhaps the key thematic problem of most endurance or durational performance, for example, some of which we might hear about later on. And that's why, arguably, we have this tendency in live art towards ethically dubious or difficult situations of being together, of intimacy, of agency and dependency. But there is little, arguably, in the way of nuanced examinations of the art in live art of how to die, to say goodbye and to die according to one's own desires. What would an ethics and an aesthetics of dying look like in live art? Well, I think that's what we see here in these works that I've been showing to you. Perhaps a culturology of death, a thanatology, a thanatography. And that is what I think we find in the last works of Jon John. And so very briefly, because I am up to my end, is just to say that the archive is not dead, it's there being animated after Jon John's death. And that it's been animated by visitors and students, but more innovatively by posthumous collaboration. So as Jon John was dying, he made a series of dreams, which Paul King described as morphine dreams, and these are mapped out in the archive. There are two ideas: one for fakir shoes of nails, and also a peacock tail attached to a large butt plug. And after Jon John's death, Paul King contacted the couturier Jochen Kroner, who happens to be Lady Gaga's couturier, to make the shoes, following a prompt on this one where Jon John has scrawled Jochen Kroner is a genius. And I contacted Jochen Kroner, who tells me that being asked, he said, "I could not say no to it. I had the feeling I had to. No question, that's all I can tell you." And then what's happened is that this work has subsequently been animated by Ron Athey, who borrowed the shoes and the peacock butt plug and enacted them in a performance. He was very much moved by a similarity to a scene in Martyrs and Saints from 1992, which was dictated by a vision by his friend Cliff Diller, who died of AIDS around the same time, and who also had a morphine dream that gave rise to the performance. And so in Acephalous Monster of 2019, Athey used Jon John's dream objects and created an aesthetic ritual in which Hermes Pitakos wore both, giving life to ideas and images that Jon John himself ran out of time in which to execute. So just to finish, to say that finally I think the archive allows us to reconstruct the work of a compelling but marginalized artist about whom little has been written and so much remains to be said. Thank you.